China's loans, a blessing for Africa or a debt trap? Let's dive down to the facts of the matter. The term China's debt trap diplomacy was coined by Indian academic Brahma Chelane to describe what he called China's predatory lending practices of deliberately lending unsustainable loans to poor countries, and when they default, force them to cede strategic leverage or even sometimes sovereign assets to China. Djibouti, a country in the Horn of Africa, is often used as a typical example of China's predatory lending practices across Africa. China owes more than 70% of Djibouti's debt, and it is claimed that when China demanded to lease its port, Djibouti had no choice but to lease it to China for $20 million per year.
Meanwhile, Uganda has lost its only international airport that it had to China after it failed to repay its loan. Now, Uganda is the latest African nation to fall into China's debt trap and has had to give up one of its key national assets to China because it was not able to repay the installments of the loan.
Wait. What? A country wants to take over another country's airport because of its debt to that country? How is that even possible? You've got to be kidding me. This brings to mind a famous quote by John Adams, US president from 1797 to 1801. He once famously said, "There are two ways to conquer and enslave a country. One is by the sword and the other is by debt." So with a stroke of a pen, China gets to own an international airport in Uganda. Well, at the end, the takeover never happened. In fact, the claims were later debunked by both the Ugandan and Chinese officials. Many believe, however, that this was because of the widespread outrage and condemnation the news generated. Was it? Do you believe those reports? You know what they say, where there is smoke, there is fire. Let me know what you think in the comment section. Now let's move on. China currently owns about 72% of Kenya's external debts, which is at about $50 billion. There are anxiety that the Mombasa port could be lost if Kenya defaults on the loan repayment. This is according to Kenya's own Auditor General. Now, the question is, despite the debt trap diplomacy claims, why are African countries scrabbling over themselves for China loans? To understand this, we have to take a step back to how China-Africa relationship developed. You see, the Chinese-African relationship started in the 1960s. But the primary focus of China then was political and ideological in nature, based upon winning allies during the Cold War era and guaranteeing supportive votes for the eventual rejection of Taiwan's credentials in the United Nations. Though the People's Republic of China did offer foreign aid to some African countries during this period, it had a limited development focus. However, since the year 2000, China's engagement in Africa has undergone a significant quantitative and qualitative transformation. Now, we have to put this in perspective and understand the political situation of Africa in the 90s. You see, the 90s was a turbulent period across the continent. In fact, between the period 1990 and 2005, 19 major armed conflicts occurred in Africa. From the First Congo War, also nicknamed Africa's First World War, which took place mostly in Zaire, present-day Democratic Republic of the Congo, with major spillovers into Sudan and Uganda. Then come the Liberia Civil War, 1989 to 2003, Eritrean-Ethiopian War, 1998, the Sierra Leone Civil War, 1991 to 2002, and then the Rwanda genocide in 1994, just to mention a few. With all these wars happening across the continent, humanitarian crisis followed. We have huge numbers of internally displaced people, famine, diseases. In fact, this was the period when HIV/AIDS was ravaging the continent. While all this was going on in Africa, globalization was taking off in other parts of the world. Western companies were outsourcing manufacturing factories to China because of cheap labor. China eventually becomes the world's factory. Everything is now being produced in China. As a result, China's economy witnessed a double-digit growth, and in order to sustain its monumental growth, China was forced to look abroad to secure natural resources and additional markets for its export. So China turns towards the only continent with the largest endowment of natural resources, Africa. Interestingly, this was the same period the West saw and treated Africa more as a problem than as an opportunity. In fact, it is on record that in the year 2000, when China hosted its first ever summit of the China-Africa Cooperation Forum, The Economist, a British weekly newspaper, described Africa as the hopeless continent, adding that the new millennium has brought more disaster than hope to Africa. So as you guys can see, so while China saw in Africa investment opportunities and zoomed in on the opportunities, the West saw Africa through the lenses of war, famine, and diseases, a continent in dire need of humanitarian aid. We all remember the Life Aid and We Are the World concerts across Europe trying to raise funds to save Africa. So for both China and Africa, it was like a partnership made in heaven. On the one hand, you have Africa with a huge infrastructure needs, but endowed abundantly with mineral resources, and China, on the other hand, has financial capabilities and technical expertise, but needs access to mineral resources. This is like a case of 1 + 1 making 2. And unlike the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, World Bank, and other Western governments who cherry-pick allies and offer lectures about democracy and transparency as preconditions for loans, China offers Africa a complete package. That is, the readiness to work with whatever government is in place, huge sums of needed revenue, increased levels of international trade and investment, technical expertise, foreign assistance, and political support in international forums. Come on, with a package like this, even Oliver Twist couldn't have asked for more. Consequently, China's investment in Africa exploded. Out of the 54 countries on the African continent, 50 have taken loans worth over $153.4 billion from Chinese agencies between 2009 and 2019. And this is according to China-Africa Research Initiative. In fact, China's trade with Africa in 2021 reached a record of $261 billion. This is 5 times more than the United States trade with Africa, which was at $64 billion in total. Gradually, the West is losing its place as Africa's preferred trading partner. And by spending lavishly across Africa like a drunken sailor on shore leave, China seeks to kill 3 birds with 1 stone. First, secure natural resources. 2, address overcapacity at home by boosting exports of goods and personnel. And thirdly, it hopes to advance its strategic interests, including expanding its diplomatic influence, promoting the international use of its currency, and gaining a relative advantage over other powers. Of course, this has not gone unnoticed by Western governments and media outlets. They have criticized the terms of Chinese state loans and their high interest rates across Africa and labeled it debt-trapped diplomacy. Are there any truth in these accusations, or are the accusations born out of fear of losing their influence in Africa? Well, let's get down to the facts of the matter, because facts matter. Here are the facts. In 2020, after reviewing and investigating Chinese loans in Ethiopia, Angola, and the Republic of Congo, Deborah Brautingham, an American political scientist and a professor of political economy at Johns Hopkins University and the director of the China-Africa Research Initiative, reported that in their studies, no evidence of debt trap was found, but instead they discovered evidence that Beijing cancelled at least $3.4 billion of debts and had restructured or refinanced around $15 billion of debt in Africa between the days of 2000 and 2019. Another report, this one by Debt Justice, an organization based in the United Kingdom, reported in a study based on World Bank figures that just 12% of African governments' external debt is owed to Chinese lenders, compared to 35% owed to Western private lenders, and that the interest rates on private loans from the West are almost double compared to loans from China. Again, in March 2022, Bloomberg News, an American-based news network, reported that despite China making Western countries uncomfortable with its large infrastructure projects in Africa, a deeper look into the evidence showed that the accusation of debt trap diplomacy towards China was completely unfounded. Even the case of Djibouti leasing its port to China, which we mentioned earlier, the fact of the matter is this: this was not the first time that Djibouti leases its land for cash reimbursement. Since 2002, Djibouti has leased parts of its land to the United States, along with the right to use the neighboring airport and seaport facilities. Another criticism is that China's loans has exponentially increased the indebtedness of many African countries, pushing some of these countries to the brink of huge financial bankruptcy that could make them lose both their most valuable natural assets and even their very sovereignty. Like, seriously? China is undercutting sovereignty in the continent? Well, this would have been a very serious charge if not for the fact that African sovereignty was already undercut over a century ago through colonialism and neo-colonialism. The point is this: Africa's indebtedness increased because, like the rest of the world, African countries are still reeling from the adverse effects of COVID-19 shutdown on the world economy, and coupled with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the soaring inflation that follows it, many African countries are struggling. Some countries have had to take on even more debts in order to meet their financial obligations. So, of course, the indebtedness increased. There are also accusations that Chinese infrastructure projects often have little connection to other infrastructure systems in the countries and are often designed mainly to support mineral resources extraction. Well, the question is, how was this different from what the West did during colonization? Roads and railway lines that were built during colonizations were built into the interior strictly to further European mining interests. In fact, in 2021, the Trinidad and Tobago government defended its decision to accept a multi-million-dollar loan from China rather than from the IMF by saying, and I quote the finance minister, "The Chinese loan has a very attractive interest rate of 2%. The IMF loan is 1.05%, so there isn't much to choose between them." However, if you are making a judgment call, one loan, no structural adjustments, you don't have to retrench people, you don't have to devalue your currency. And then another, you have to do all kind of terrible things. That is a no-brainer. Obviously, you did go with the one that doesn't have any structural adjustment conditionalities associated with it, especially since the interest rates are very close, just 1% apart. And if you consider this, then obviously the West has no moral ground to criticize China for debt trap diplomacy and predatory lending practices. Otherwise, this would be a case of the pot calling the kettle black. One other thing we have to understand, China's loan agreements in Africa are not unilateral. They are bilateral agreements signed by both parties concerned. So to term these loans as debt trap is not only derogatory, but condescending to African leaders. Are you saying that 50 out of 54 African countries that have taken China's loans, none of them is capable and smart enough to read and understand agreement clauses and fine prints? Please do understand, we are not saying that China is a saint. We are fully aware that China's investments in Africa is not out of the goodness of their heart. These are strictly business ventures with the aim of exerting maximum profitability returns. But the fact is, China has in less than a generation embarked on more infrastructure developments across Africa, more than the US and Europe combined. And for the very first time, Africans are seeing the direct benefits of their natural resources in roads, bridges, railway lines. Unlike before, when royalties that are paid for the extraction of these resources disappeared into the pockets of corrupt politicians and their foreign investment partners. All in all, Western criticism of China's debt trap diplomacy has been proven even by Western media outlets that they are far-fetched and born out of desperation and anxiety over its declining influence across the Africa continent. Trying to talk down Chinese loans will not work. Instead, Western countries should respond by reflecting on their own approach to Africa. The West have to understand and realize that this is a new game that requires new rules of engagement. They need to re-strategize and shift their perception of Africa from an aid beneficiary to that of an investment partner. Seriously, in my opinion, the best thing that China has done for Africa is that its emergence challenges the monopoly Western countries have held over Africa, particularly over the last few decades. Africa is now like a beautiful bride that is being courted from both sides. And with the technological innovations of smartphones and other smart appliances, electric cars and renewable energy that have transformed the modern way of life, Western dependency on Africa has grown even much higher than ever before. Therefore, there is no better time like now for African countries to rise up, unite, and leverage the world's dependency on its natural resources to negotiate more equitable and equally beneficial investment relationships that support sustainable economic growth for the continent. And according to Paul Kagame, African countries should not be pressured into making or accepting choices between the US and China. It is important for the continent to have partnerships with both countries and others as long as they respect Africa and recognize its contributions. And that is the fact of the matter. Okay guys, thanks for watching this video. And as usual, on this program, you know we don't take sides. We address issues and ask obvious questions. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, share, and subscribe. Let us grow this channel together. Looking forward to seeing you next week on another episode of Facts of the Matter. And until then, please stay safe.